Seated. Open your Bibles with me, if you would, to the book of Daniel, although we're really going to be at first in the introductory portions of the message, kind of in several other prophetic books, but obviously we're studying the book of Daniel. And what we've seen over the last several weeks is starting with Nebuchadnezzar's imagery of that image, and then Daniel explains that to him, and how that we could see that would have been Gentile nations unfolding, and that started with Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel said to him, "Thou art the head of gold." And then we had the four beasts in Daniel's vision. And that was the same, not the same imagery, but teaching the same thing. And that gave a little more information. That gave a little more understanding. Again, it was the Gentile nations. And what I always take away from that was that man views the regimes and the empires and the ruling kingdoms as glorious and wonderful, and God views them as beasts. We saw that in the visions that Daniel had previous to the one we're looking at in chapter 8. And it was beastly kingdoms stirred up out of the sea of humanity that God stirred. And God causes one to rise and take over another one. And we kept emphasizing that Gentile nations all the way to the time of the return of the Lord. And then chapter 8 comes along, and I remind you that in chapter 8, the writing it takes back up again in Hebrew, that's focused on the history or the future of, and in our case, history of the Hebrew people. And so it was in Aramaic for a section, and more openly understandable language at that time. And then chapter 8 starts back in Hebrew. And so in chapter 8, we begin to see more beasts. We begin to see the imagery similar to the previous vision of Daniel. And what we're going to see, and he will flat out tell us tonight, I'm talking about the Medo-Persian Empire, and I'm talking about the Greek Empire. And what I want to do before we get into that section of chapter 8 is show you and point out to you that God names these empires, in some cases over a century before they show up. We read these things in Jeremiah and Isaiah, and unless you're really savvy to the time that it's being stated, you don't think that much of it. And I'm guilty of that too. I'm not making accusation. But you take a Reese Chronological Bible, which is where I'm getting most of my dates. I found it to be one of the most reliable, I think, most dependable resources for chronology. And we'll read a portion of Scripture tonight that is, according to the Reese Chronological Bible, 170 or so years prior to the entrance of what it was Isaiah had to say. And so, Daniel chapter 8, and we'll look at verse just 1 and 2, and then we're going to get a little technical and turn a lot of pages for a few minutes. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. So he references the one that he'd seen earlier. Now this is 2 years later. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. And so that Daniel's telling and emphasizing, I saw this. I interpreted what Nebuchadnezzar saw first, and then I saw one in the first year of Belshazzar, and now in the third year of Belshazzar, I've seen another one. And it's me. I'm not hearsay witness. I saw this. So a little bit of history. The Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians unite in an empire as a power around 550 BC. Keep that number in your mind. Roughly 550 years before Christ. The Medes and the Persians come together, and they factor prominently in these visions. The two shoulders, two arms, Medes and Persians. The one beast with one side higher than the other in Daniel's first vision, Medes and Persians. Tonight we'll see it again, the Medes and Persians. They unite as a force around 550 BC. All right, Jeremiah 51. Turn back with me, if you would, to Jeremiah 51 and verse 11. I don't want to throw too many numbers at you and make it just get all lost in all the weeds of numbers, but I think this is fascinating. Jeremiah 51 verse 11. I want you to notice this with me. Make bright the arrows and gather the shields. The Lord hath raised up the spirit of the kings, plural, don't miss that, the kings, plural, of the Medes. For his device is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple. Now, Jeremiah is saying this many years before this has happened. And what I really wanted you to see in this passage was that the Lord hath raised up the spirit of the kings, of the Medes, and the Lord is behind this. He has a purpose in everything that he does, and the people of God were going to be in Babylonian captivity, and Daniel read and saw that was going to be for 70 years, and that Babylonian captivity had to come to an end, and God made it come to an end by raising up the Medes and the Persians. And we'll see that as this unfolds. Remember the night with the writing on the wall, and that very night the kingdom fell, and the Medes took over, and that was all told about years earlier by Jeremiah. And in Isaiah 45. And if you don't stop to think about it, especially like Isaiah 45, if you don't stop to think about it, you don't quickly and obviously see the fact that God is saying things years before he brings them to pass, before the kings are even known about. He names them by name. In Isaiah 45 and the very first part of verse 1, just the first portion of it. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand have I holden, to subdue nations before him. I'm going to raise up Cyrus. Now, if you have a Bible with some dates in it, you'll notice that like I have a Thompson chain, and off to the side of chapter 45, it says 712 BC. This is 150 plus years. I think it's 173 on the calculator, but this, for round numbers, 153 years before Cyrus did anything as it relates to taking a kingdom. And Isaiah here is saying, by the Lord is saying it, Isaiah is recording it for us, but and he's even called him his anointed. Look at the verse 28, verse 28 of the previous chapter. Just back up a verse. That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. I'm going to use Cyrus, and shall perform all my pleasure. Even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. And we understand that at the conclusion of the 70 years of captivity, brought about largely because of the Medes and Persians, Cyrus being one of those kings, at the conclusion of that, their captivity is overthrown, and little by little, and in waves, they're able to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And Isaiah is calling Cyrus by name many years before he was even born. And that fascinates me. I love that. We read that and you think, oh, it's history. From Isaiah's vantage point, it's history. No. It's prophetic from Isaiah's vantage point. Now, Daniel 5. Daniel chapter 5. I want you to notice verse 28 with me. And forgive me for a little bit. We're going to be just a little technical and work our way chronologically to this point where the chapter 8 comes up. So in Isaiah, Cyrus is named 170 years before he does anything noteworthy as it relates to Babylon. Daniel chapter 5 and verse 28. Notice, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. I mean, Daniel is interpreting the handwriting on the wall. And as a part of that, he sees that the kingdom is going to fall, and that night it did. And it's going to be given to the Medes and Persians, which, by the way, Isaiah said, referenced Cyrus, one of the kings of the Persians, in 170 years previous. Now, look at verse 30-31. And what's interesting about 28 to me, before you get to 30-31, I just thought of this, that both portions of the kingdom are named. In Nebuchadnezzar's image, thou art the head of gold, but then under that was the Medes and Persians, the 2 shoulders, 2 arms. And the 2 portions of that representing the Medes and the Persian, the Medo-Persian Empire. And in chapter 5 and verse 28, they're both named before they take over. Now they're in existence. They're like literally at the gate. But they're both named. Verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old, about 62 years old. And so this is roughly 538. Remember, we had told you that the Medes and the Persians united in 550. So the Medes and the Persians have been together, what, a dozen years or so. And now God raised him up for a purpose, to march in and conquer the Babylonian people, starting the releasing process of the Jewish captivity. Now, Ezra chapter 5. We're almost done with this. As I got to digging on this, I just found it fascinating. Ezra chapter 5 and verse 13. I skipped past Ezra here and went into Nehemiah. Ezra 5:13. But in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the same King Cyrus made a decree to build this house of God. So when Cyrus took over, as that process is unfolding and one empire falls and another empire begins to take over, Cyrus makes a decree to build the Lord's house. And the process begins of allowing them to go back to Jerusalem and do just that. And then you get, and what does that say, 5:13? Cyrus, king of Babylon. Babylon has fallen to the Medo-Persian Empire. So now in Daniel chapter 8, we begin to pick this up again. And what I wanted you to see is how that God has stated through his prophets, especially Isaiah and Jeremiah, exactly what he was going to do, and in Isaiah's case 170 years before he did it, naming the name of Cyrus. Why do you think people that hate God hate the Bible? Because they say, well, how is that possible? Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and Isaiah and Daniel weren't even contemporary. They're saying the same thing. The fix is in. That somebody looked back in history and wrote these things and ascribed it to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel, and they try to explain the accuracy of the prophetic work of God, that somebody they late dating their writing, or early dating their writing, however you want to look at it, and they say somebody had to look back. No, the Holy Spirit's the author, and he can make Daniel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Ezra just fit together without any problems. And they don't have to be contemporary to compare their notes. God is the author of this book. And he's so patient with us. He teaches like we teach children. You teach children the very basics, and then when they get that mastered, you give them a little more, and when they get that mastered, you give them a little more. The image of Nebuchadnezzar, very general. The four kingdoms were in view, no doubt, but very general. The next set of four beasts, more information, especially as it relates to the last beast and the little horn and all that. This, in chapter 8, more information. Line upon line, layer upon layer, row upon row, giving us what is called progressive revelation. It's not different, it's just building upon. And chapter 8 builds upon the previous vision of chapter 4. The chapter 7, the four beasts, and then which has already been building on the imagery of that image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in chapter 2. So last week we looked at Daniel the prophet. Last week, and I'm indebted to Wiersbe on how to break chapter 8 down, because it's nearly impossible to outline, but I like the way Wiersbe did it, and I'm following that he took the references that dealt with Daniel the prophet. And last week we looked at that. We looked at his work as a statesman, as a prophet. We looked at his work as God's man in place to have the king's ear. Very respected in his position, very elevated in his position, and very trusted, and very hated by those that wanted to have the king's ear more than Daniel. But Daniel was given unique understanding to visions and so on. God used him in some very unique ways. God used him as a man in some very powerful testimony ways. And he's just had Daniel in the right place to be a liaison for his people, and certainly a good testimony for the Lord. And we've seen that. And then he understands and explains Nebuchadnezzar's image and so on, and how that God used him. Well, in chapter 8, we're backing up a little bit. We're going back to the 3rd year of Belshazzar, and he would be in Babylon, But in this text, it tells us that he was in the spirit taken to Shushan. I mean, that's how I understand it. It doesn't explicitly say that in the spirit he was, but that's how I understand it, that in the spirit he was taken to Shushan. And that's where headquarters is about to be. And God takes him there. And so we looked last week at Daniel the prophet. This week we want to look at the beginning of this. And again, he uses the beast imagery. Tonight's going to be a ram and a goat. Man thinks his kingdoms are just glorious and wonderful and beautiful. And again, God views them as beastly things. One beast devouring another beast, devouring another beast. All fulfilling God's perfect plan and purpose. Verse 3, we see the ram. Verse 3, Daniel says, I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. So Daniel is in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. He's still in the Babylonian cabinet. He's still a part of the Babylonian government. It'll be called the Chaldeans a few times. It's virtually interchangeable, Chaldean, Babylonian. And that's still intact. This text in chapter 8 is chronologically prior to the handwriting on the wall and the fall to the Medes. And we explained that he's starting and he's working his way through these visions and giving more information to explain Gentile history and the 4 prominent empires. And he sees by the river, before the river, a ram. And the ram had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high. These horns represent authority and power. And in the Bible, that horn often does. And these were high. They were powerful. And it says, interestingly enough, one was higher than the other and came up last. And you'll see that will be an emphasis on the Medo-Persian Empire and the Persian portion of the empire being stronger. And just a quick Google search, you can find some of those things out and see that it verifies what, in verse 20, the Lord will interpret this for him. So I'm getting somewhat ahead of myself. But he saw a ram with 2 horns. And I saw, verse 4, the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there anything that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. So this ram, which in verse 20 will be identified as the Medo-Persian Empire, this ram is devouring whatever it wants to devour. This ram with the 2 horns, one being a little higher than the other, the Persian portion of the empire being a little stronger than the Medo portion. This ram in verse 4, pushing westward, northward, southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. When they were at the apex of their power, nobody could stop the Medo-Persian Empire because God allowed them to come together. God allowed them to become great. God allowed them to become that conquering force because he had a purpose in it. He was going to overthrow Babylon and have the children of Israel be released from their captivity. And so jump up to verse 20 with me. He's asked for an interpretation. He's asked for understanding. Here's the answer. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. So that's the kings of the Medo-Persian Empire. Remember, early in Daniel chapter 5, the Medo-Persian Empire, the two empires were named. Remember in Isaiah, Cyrus is named by name long before he's the king of the Median Empire. And so, remember what we read in Jeremiah 51. God stirred them. He called them His anointed. God stirred them for the purpose of overthrowing Babylon. And we read that already in Jeremiah 51 and verse 11. If you go to chapter 9 of our text here, of Daniel, if you go to chapter 9, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, so now the Medes are over the Babylonians. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in desolations of Jerusalem. Daniel says, I've been reading the books. I've been reading God's word. I've been reading Jeremiah. And 70 years will be accomplished. And that will soon be up. And things will begin to change. And he uses the Medo-Persian Empire to bring that to pass. And you can read in Ezra chapter 1 where Cyrus authorizes the Jews to go back home and begin to be rebuilding the temple. So Daniel, as he's getting more information about Gentile history to us, Gentile future for him, he has seen Nebuchadnezzar. Thou art the head of gold. He lived through the end of that. And he saw by these visions the Medo-Persian Empire come, and he saw the handwriting on the wall. And today, you're losing the kingdom today, dude. It's done. And that very day he did. And Daniel sees all this, and here it's described to him as a goat. As a ram. I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, by the river a ram. So back to verse 5. Daniel chapter 8, verse 5. And I was considering. So Daniel is soaking this up. Daniel's thinking about that ram. Two horns, one higher than the other. Doing whatever it wants. It goes in any direction. Doing whatever it wills to do. Nobody can stop it. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. Most think that that's indicating he's moving so rapidly, it's like he's not even touching the ground, just moving rapidly. The ram, I'm sorry, I almost missed part of verse 5 that's very, very important. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between its eyes. So this goat that's moving swiftly had a horn between its eyes. It was notable. It was interesting. It was odd. It was not normal. Well, this goat with the horn between its eyes, verse 6, and he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. So this interesting ram with two horns, Daniel's studying that, one horn higher than the other, and this goat with one horn, oddly located, shows up, and I saw that, and this ram, the goat, Verse 7, and I saw him come close to the ram, and he was moved with choler against him. That word means bitterness. He moved with choler against him and smote the ram. The goat with one horn smote the ram, brake its two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. So this one that had two horns, that dominated everything, now all of a sudden couldn't stand against the goat. There's no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. And the goat waxed great, verse 8. The goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up four notable horns toward the four winds of heaven. So in this goat that overpowered the ram with two horns, the ram that had originally been able to dominate anywhere it wanted to go, now the goat rises up and conquers it, but it had this odd single horn. And then it broke off. It suddenly broke off, and four horns came out in its place. Verse 21. The rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that was between his eyes is the first king. And you begin to do just a little history search for us, easy for us, little Google search, and you find out Alexander the Great was the first ruler, the first king, if you will, the first leader of that empire. And Alexander the Great comes onto the scene roughly 333 years before Christ. So we're 200 years in the future. It was 539 years before Christ that Cyrus takes over in Babylon, conquers Babylon. And so the Medo-Persian empires lasted a couple hundred years, and Alexander the Great raises up, and you don't realize how young he was. Only 33 when he died, and he died, many say, out of despondency. He was so sad there was nothing else he could find to conquer. It seemed as though there was nothing else to conquer, and he died suddenly. The way most people write it, most historians write it, between despair and an over-abuse of alcohol, he died suddenly, 33 years old. Wasn't expecting it, wasn't prepared for it, and I mean practically in his kingdom. He had named no successors, but he had four main generals. And after his sudden death, the four generals get together and say, you take this quarter, I'll take this quarter, you take this quarter, and you take this quarter, and the empire is now ours. Look at this, verse 21. The rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. They were stronger under Alexander the Great than they ever were as four kingdoms or four portions of maybe four states within a kingdom. They were stronger under Alexander the Great. Most of this secular history just proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that we're talking about Alexander the Great and his sudden death at 33 years old, and the four kings excuse me, that took over, his four top generals that took over and divide the kingdom four ways. but they're never quite as strong as what it was under Alexander the Great. And Daniel is seeing this ram and then this goat conquer that ram, and he's seeing the Medo-Persian Empire. And again, chapter 8 is before it's actually happened. He's seeing the Medo-Persian Empire, and he's seeing it with the ability to conquer Babylon, and it does. And he knows why. He knows why it's going to. Captivity's about over. I saw from the reading of the books that this is about to end, and he knows that's going to happen. And Daniel sees, a few years before the Medo-Persian Empire takes over, he sees what he now understands to be used as the imagery of the ram with the two horns. And he says, that's who's going to take over Babylon. That's going to take over Belshazzar and company. And then he sees in this vision the goat. And the Lord explains to him that the goat is an empire under Alexander the Great that isn't even there yet, that's going to come and conquer the Medo-Persian Empire. And the Bible's a fascinating book when you consider its accuracy, when you consider its the intricate nature, the detailed nature of what the Lord is saying. And he's saying it now, in this case, years in advance of what takes place. And Daniel is studying this. Daniel is like taking it in. And you understand, if he'd have got this first, if this would have been first, he wouldn't have understood all this. It's probably hard enough, but he gets the imagery of Nebuchadnezzar's image, and he gets that picture, and he gets that explanation. And then he gets the four beasts in chapter 7, and he gets a little more detail and shows how that's four, very specifically, four nations rising up out of the sea of humanity. And that God views them as beastly. And that out of the last one, the little horn would come up, and that's going to come up again. And so he's getting more detail in chapter 8. And he's getting more detail before it even happens. And I love that. Read Daniel chapter 8, 9, just read it, digest it. The more you read it, the more it begins to make sense, the more you can untangle it. But I've enjoyed it, and I find it fascinating to take these little expeditions off out into the weeds and show time frames. I hope it's not too boring, but I enjoyed it. We're going to be dismissed in prayer, and again, out of an abundance of caution, I'm going to dismiss myself. I've been trying to be super careful, and so we're going to be dismissed in prayer and go on with the evening then.